The first truck arrived just after sunrise. It slowly turned off the main road, rolled through the old wooden gate, and stopped on the empty patch of land behind her nursery. The truck bed lifted, releasing a dark red mass of grape skins, seeds, and crushed stems left behind after the juice had been pressed out. A sweet, sour smell quickly spread across the property. By noon, flies had begun to gather. The neighbor across the fence stared at the growing pile and shook his head. To him, it was nothing more than winery waste, wet, fermenting material with no real value. But to her, every delivery helped pay another overdue bill. The nearby winery needed somewhere to dispose of the pomace left after harvest. She needed money to keep her struggling nursery alive. Their agreement was simple. The winery would pay a small fee to use an abandoned corner of her property as a temporary dumping site. At first, she thought nothing more of it. The money was enough to buy a few more seeds, repair several leaking irrigation lines, and keep the business running for another season. But with every delivery, the pile grew larger, forming a dark red mound against the dry, exhausted soil. One afternoon after a rainstorm, she walked past the pile and noticed something strange. The ground beneath the pomace was no longer hard and dusty like the surrounding soil. When she pushed a shovel into the darkened material, a wave of warmth rose from below. Thin white fungal threads ran through the pile, earthworms moved beneath the surface, and the air carried the rich smell of fallen leaves on a forest floor. She crouched down and held a handful of the decomposing material. Everyone called it waste. But waste did not usually hold moisture this long. Waste did not usually bring worms and fungi back to land that had seemed almost lifeless. For the first time, she wondered whether those trucks were delivering something far more valuable than a dumping fee. The nursery had not always looked so tired. Years earlier, the rows had been full of young trees, flowering shrubs, and trays of seedlings waiting for customers. But now, empty spaces appeared between the benches. Several irrigation lines leaked into the dirt, plastic pots had been reused until their sides cracked, and the greenhouse roof carried patches from storms she could no longer afford to repair properly. The problem was not a lack of effort. She worked before sunrise, watered by hand when the pump failed, mixed soil late into the evening, and drove long distances to deliver small orders herself. Still, the numbers kept moving in the wrong direction. The soil on her property was poor and compacted. During summer, it hardened like brick. After heavy rain, water ran across the surface instead of soaking in. Young plants needed constant watering, and many struggled to develop strong roots. Then the cost of potting mix rose. The nursery depended on purchased compost, bark, and other growing materials brought in from outside. Each delivery cost more than the last. Fertilizer prices climbed. Fuel became more expensive. Customers continued asking for discounts, while larger nurseries sold common plants at prices she could barely match. By the end of the season, she had begun opening bills in the order of urgency. Electricity first, water second, suppliers only when they threatened to stop deliveries. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of invoices, and a notice from the bank. She added the numbers 3 times, hoping she had made a mistake. She had not. If the next growing season failed, she would have to sell part of the property. If that was not enough, the entire nursery might be gone. Outside the window, the dark mound of Grape Pomace sat at the edge of the field. Until then, it had been little more than a temporary source of dumping fees, but now she looked at it differently. The winery was paying to remove it. She was paying heavily to bring organic growing materials onto the farm. Somewhere between those two facts was a question she could no longer ignore. What if the material she needed was already arriving by the truckload? She did not know whether the pomace could save the nursery, but for the first time in months, she had something more useful than hope. She had a reason to experiment. The next morning, she returned to the pile with a shovel, a bucket, and an old notebook. She began by digging into 3 different sections. The outer layer was still wet and sharp-smelling, but deeper inside, the material had changed. The color was darker. The texture was softer. Heat rose from the center even though the morning air was cool. She pressed her hand against the side of the pile and pulled it back. The pomace was warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to prove that something active was happening inside. The grape skins, seeds, and stems were breaking down. She filled the bucket with material from the middle of the pile and carried it toward the nursery. On the way, she noticed that the weeds growing near the mound looked greener than those farther away. The soil beneath them was softer too. She knelt and pushed her fingers into the ground. It crumbled instead of cracking. A few inches below the surface, she found thin white threads running through the soil. She had seen similar growth in bags of bark and old compost before. Fungi were moving through the material, breaking it apart and connecting it with the soil below. Then she saw the worms. They twisted away from the light as she lifted another shovel of dark earth. There had never been many worms in that part of the property. The ground had been too dry, too compacted, and too poor in organic matter. Now they were gathering beneath what everyone else had called waste. She wrote down everything she observed: warmth, moisture, fungal threads, softer soil, greener weeds, and earthworms. None of it proved that grape pomace could become a safe growing medium, but it proved that the pile was not lifeless. That afternoon, she collected small soil samples from 3 locations, directly beneath the pomace, several feet away from it, and from one of the struggling nursery beds. She placed each sample in a separate jar. The difference was visible. The soil beneath the pile was darker and held together in soft crumbs. The nursery soil was pale, dusty, and dense. When she added water, the darker sample absorbed it slowly, while the dry soil resisted it before turning into mud. For the first time, the pile no longer looked like a burden. It looked like a question waiting to be answered, and if she could understand what was happening inside it, she might have found the first piece of a way out. She began with 12 seedling trays. It seemed simple enough. She mixed a small amount of fresh grape pomace into her usual potting medium, filled the trays, and planted the same native shrubs she had grown many times before. For the first 2 days, nothing appeared wrong. The mixture looked rich and dark. It held moisture longer than her normal soil, and the seedlings stood upright beneath the greenhouse lights. Encouraged, she prepared several more trays with an even larger amount of pomace. By the 4th morning, the greenhouse smelled different. The sweet scent had turned sharp and alcoholic. Tiny bubbles appeared beneath the surface of the wet growing mix. When she pressed her fingers into one tray, heat rose around them. The material was still fermenting. Several seedlings had begun to wilt. Their leaves curled inward, although the soil was damp. By evening, pale patches appeared along the stems. The following morning, half the plants had collapsed. She pulled one seedling from the tray. Its roots were brown, soft, and damaged. In her rush to find a cheap replacement for purchased compost, she had mistaken active waste for finished soil. The pomace was still breaking down. Microorganisms were consuming it, producing heat and creating unstable conditions around the young roots. She tried flushing the trays with water, but that only made the mixture heavier and more airless. A sour liquid drained from the bottoms of the pots. Within days, nearly the entire batch was lost. The failure cost her weeks of work and a collection of seeds she could not easily replace. For several hours, she considered ending the experiment. The neighbors had been right about one thing. The pile could not simply be spread wherever she wanted plants to grow. Used carelessly, it was not a resource, it was a risk. But when she emptied the dead trays, she noticed that the oldest material from the bottom of the pile behaved differently. It smelled earthy rather than sour. It was cooler, looser, and no longer sticky. Fresh pomace and decomposed pomace were not the same material. That distinction changed the entire experiment. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of a clean page. Do not feed the plants first. Feed the decomposition process. The dead seedlings had given her the first real rule of the system. Before grape pomace could help anything grow, it had to finish changing. The next day, she divided the grape pomace into several smaller piles. Instead of treating it as finished compost, she began treating it as a raw ingredient. She mixed the wet pomace with dry leaves, shredded branches, old bark, and a small amount of straw. The goal was simple: reduce excess moisture, improve airflow, and give the microorganisms a more balanced mixture to break down. At first, the piles behaved differently. One became too wet and developed a sour smell. Another dried out before decomposition could continue. A third heated quickly, then cooled after only a few days. She recorded each change in her notebook. She checked the temperature with an old compost thermometer, squeezed handfuls to test moisture, and turned the piles whenever the centers became dense or airless. When the material smelled sharp, she added more dry carbon-rich matter. When it stopped heating, she added water and mixed it again. The work was slow and messy. Purple stains covered her gloves. Grape seeds collected in the folds of her boots. Some mornings steam rose from the piles as she turned them in the cold air. But gradually, the changes became easier to recognize. The sweet alcoholic odor faded. The sticky grape skins softened and disappeared into a darker mixture. The piles stopped collapsing into wet masses and began forming loose, crumbly material. Weeks later, she opened the oldest pile. It no longer smelled like a winery. It smelled like damp forest soil. She sifted a small amount through a screen. What remained was dark, light in the hand and cool to the touch. It still contained pieces of seed and stem, but the unstable heat and sourness were gone. She did not assume it was ready for every plant. Instead, she tested it carefully. She mixed small percentages into separate pots, planted quick-growing cover crops, and compared them with pots containing her usual commercial mix. The first results were modest but encouraging. The treated pots stayed moist longer. Their soil surface did not harden as quickly, and the roots spread more evenly through the container. For the first time, she had not merely found a way to dispose of the pomace. She had begun to control its transformation. The pile was no longer something happening to her property. It was becoming a material she could design. Once the compost became stable, she moved to the next problem. Compost alone was not enough. Some pots held too much water. Others became dense after repeated irrigation. Young roots needed moisture, but they also needed air. If the mixture stayed wet for too long, the same plants she was trying to save could suffer from weak roots and disease. So she began building a formula. She combined small amounts of finished Grape Pomace compost with aged bark, coarse sand, and lightweight material that created space between the particles. Each batch was labeled with a different ratio. Then she planted identical seedlings in every mix. She watered them at the same time, placed them under the same light, and recorded how quickly each pot dried. Every few days, she removed one plant to inspect its roots. The early versions were inconsistent. One mixture drained so quickly that the seedlings wilted by afternoon. Another stayed heavy and cold. A third looked promising at first, but compressed after several weeks. She adjusted the ratios again. Less compost in the seed-starting mix, more structure for larger pots, a coarser blend for drought-tolerant plants, a softer, finer mix for delicate seedlings. Slowly, one formula began to stand out. The pots stayed moist without becoming waterlogged. Their surfaces remained loose instead of forming a hard crust. When she lifted the seedlings, pale roots filled the containers and held the growing mix together. The difference became even clearer during a hot week. Plants in her old commercial mix needed frequent watering and showed stress by late afternoon. The plants in the new blend remained upright longer, and their leaves recovered more quickly after watering. She still refused to call it perfect. Instead, she tested it on several native shrubs, flowering plants, and young trees. Some species responded well. Others required additional drainage or a lower proportion of compost. That variation taught her another important lesson. There would not be one magical recipe for every plant. The real value was in creating a family of growing mixes, each designed for a specific purpose. She wrote the first 3 names in her notebook: Seedling Blend, Native Plant Blend, Drought-Resilient Tree Blend. What had begun as a desperate attempt to lower costs was becoming something more valuable. She was no longer copying the materials sold by larger nurseries. She was developing a growing system of her own. The new growing mixes solved only part of the problem. She still had to decide what kind of nursery she wanted to build. For years, she had tried to compete with larger businesses by selling the same common shrubs, flowers, and decorative trees. They could buy in greater volume, advertise more widely, and lower their prices whenever they wanted. She could not beat them by becoming a smaller version of them, so she changed direction. She began collecting seeds from native grasses, flowering plants, shrubs, and trees that already survived in the local climate. These plants were not always the most colorful ones in a catalog, but they tolerated dry summers, poor soil, strong wind, and irregular rainfall. They also served a larger purpose. Some supported bees and butterflies, others provided shelter for birds, stabilized exposed soil, or developed deep roots that helped water move into the ground. She organized the nursery around those functions. One section held drought-tolerant plants, another was dedicated to pollinator habitats, a third contained trees and shrubs intended for erosion control, windbreaks, and damaged landscapes. Her new compost blends became part of the same system. Grape Pomace fed the compost piles. The finished compost went into specialized growing mixes. Those mixes produced plants designed to restore exhausted soil and reduce water use. Nothing operated alone anymore. She reused pots whenever they remained safe and strong. Broken branches and leaves returned to the composting area. Rainwater from the greenhouse roof was directed into storage tanks for later irrigation. Even plants that could not be sold immediately found a purpose. Some were moved into demonstration beds, where customers could see how native species performed together. Others were planted along the edges of the property to create habitat and protect the soil. Slowly, the nursery began to look different. It was no longer simply a place where plants were grown and sold. It had become a working example of how waste, soil, water, and vegetation could support one another. Customers noticed. They stayed longer, asked more questions, and began bringing photographs of dry yards, eroding slopes, and neglected fields. She realized they were not only searching for plants, they were searching for a way to repair the places they cared about. That was the moment her nursery stopped being a struggling retail business. It became a regenerative system with a purpose. At first, the change appeared in small ways. A customer who had come for one drought-tolerant shrub returned 2 weeks later for 12 more. A local landscaper asked why her native plants looked stronger than the same species he had purchased elsewhere. Another customer wanted help restoring a dry slope, where ordinary garden plants had repeatedly failed. The nursery was no longer attracting people who simply wanted something decorative. It was attracting people with problems. Some had yards that consumed too much water. Others had bare soil, declining pollinator populations, or land that became muddy in winter and hard as stone in summer. She began listening more carefully. Instead of asking customers what color flowers they wanted, she asked how much sun the land received, where water collected, how quickly the soil dried, and what they hoped the space could become. Then she grouped plants into practical solutions. There were pollinator bundles for small gardens, drought-resilient collections for exposed properties, and erosion control packages for slopes and stream edges. Each bundle included simple planting guidance and a small amount of the compost-based soil blend she had developed. Customers responded to the clarity. They were no longer forced to choose among rows of unfamiliar plants without understanding what would survive. The nursery gave them a plan. Word spread. Photographs began arriving from customers showing bees on native flowers, young trees surviving heat, and once bare slopes covered in new growth. A few people shared those results in local gardening groups. Soon, larger inquiries followed. A vineyard wanted plants for areas between service roads. A school requested a pollinator garden. A landowner asked for hundreds of native shrubs to stabilize an eroding field. The orders were still modest compared with those handled by large commercial nurseries, but they were more valuable. Customers were paying not only for plants but also for knowledge, selection, and confidence. She raised prices carefully. Not because the plants had suddenly become expensive to grow, but because the nursery was now offering something harder to copy. Plants matched to real land problems and supported by a regenerative growing system. For the first time, she stopped competing on price alone. People were not buying the cheapest tree or shrub available. They were buying a better chance that it would survive. By the third growing season, the nursery had outgrown its original sales table. The first sign was not a dramatic contract, it was the waiting list. Landscapers began reserving native shrubs months before planting season. Property owners ordered complete restoration packages instead of purchasing individual plants. Customers who had tested her soil blends returned for larger quantities. She realized the nursery was no longer selling separate products. It was operating as a connected system. Plant sales remained the foundation, but they now led to other services. A customer buying trees often needed help preparing the soil. A landowner ordering erosion control plants also needed a planting plan. Landscapers who trusted her seedlings began purchasing the growing mixes used to produce them. She introduced 3 clear revenue lines. The first supplied native plants for residential and commercial landscapes. The second sold compost-based growing blends in bags and bulk loads. The third provided site assessments, planting plans, and restoration support. Then came a project larger than anything she had handled before. A regional contractor needed thousands of plants for a damaged roadside corridor. The site had compacted soil, severe summer heat, and little access to irrigation. Instead of offering decorative plants, she proposed a combination of deep-rooted native grasses, hardy shrubs, young trees, and a soil amendment made from finished Grape Pomace compost. The order forced her to grow carefully. She hired seasonal workers, created a production schedule, and converted an unused shed into a covered screening and storage area. She also began tracking every batch of compost, every planting mix, and every crop of seedlings. Growth could no longer depend on memory and improvisation. It needed a repeatable system. At the end of the year, she returned to the kitchen table where she had once sorted unpaid bills by urgency. This time she opened a different set of records. The nursery had crossed 6 figures in annual revenue. No single product had created that number. It came from plants, soil blends, planning services, and restoration contracts reinforcing one another. The Grape Pomace had reduced one of her largest expenses. But the real business was not compost. It was her ability to turn waste into healthier plants into reliable solutions, and reliable solutions into a business that could survive without competing on price alone. A year earlier, the winery had paid her to take the Grape Pomace away. Now its manager stood beside the composting area, watching workers screen the dark finished material into neat piles. The sour, wet waste he remembered was gone. In its place was a stable compost used in growing mixes, restoration projects, and nursery production. Nearby, rows of young native trees stood in containers, their roots filling the soil she had developed through months of failure and adjustment. The manager had not come to dispose of another load. He had come to negotiate. The winery wanted a long-term agreement. It needed a reliable way to handle its seasonal pomace, and it had begun receiving questions from customers about waste reduction and environmental responsibility. For the first time, the material was no longer being discussed as a burden. It was being discussed as an asset. She listened carefully. The winery offered regular deliveries, cleaner separation of the pomace, and support for expanding the composting area. In return, it wanted to be recognized as a partner in the regenerative system. She did not accept immediately. The original arrangement had helped her survive, but the balance of power had changed. Her nursery now depended on consistent, high-quality material, and the winery benefited from the story her business had created around its former waste. So she set new conditions. The pomace had to arrive without plastic, trash, or chemical contamination. Delivery schedules had to match the nursery's capacity. The winery would contribute to storage and handling costs. This time, she was not accepting whatever was dumped on her land. She was purchasing an input on her own terms. When the agreement was signed, several neighbors who had once complained about the smell came to see the nursery. They walked past healthy rows of drought-tolerant plants, pollinator gardens, and stacks of bagged soil blend. The old dumping ground had disappeared. In its place stood the center of a business. She stopped beside one of the first trees grown in the Grape Pomace mix. It had started as a weak seedling in a cracked pot. Now its roots were strong enough to be planted on a damaged hillside. The transformation had never been about turning waste into gold overnight. It had been about learning to observe, test, fail, and build a system around what others ignored. The winery saw a disposal problem. She saw a material in the middle of becoming something else. And that difference saved her land.